He thought he'd chosen a life of solitude in the forest, until a single cry changed everything. What happened next will leave you speechless. Like, subscribe, and stay with us to witness an unforgettable story. The sun had not yet climbed above the treetops when Marcus stepped out of his cabin. The morning was cold and still, the kind of stillness that presses against your chest. He pulled his jacket tighter, took a breath of the crisp mountain air, and started down the narrow forest path with his fishing gear slung over one shoulder. A thin mist hovered low among the trees, and the scent of damp earth and pine filled his lungs. It was just another morning in the woods, quiet, secluded, peaceful, just the way he liked it. For 5 years, Marcus had lived alone at the edge of the forest, tucked away from the world in a hand-built log cabin. Once a military field medic, he'd seen too much, lost too much. A younger brother killed by an IED, friends buried in silence. Every news report, every headline, every well-meant condolence from people who never really knew, none of it brought peace. So he'd come here, to the place where the only sounds were those of bird song, rustling branches, and his own heartbeat. He fished, chopped wood, cooked over an open flame. It wasn't easy, but it was honest. The forest didn't lie to him. It didn't pity him. He'd only gone about 200 yards from his cabin when he heard it. A howl, sharp, trembling, echoing across the stillness. It wasn't the confident call of a wild wolf claiming territory. It was something else entirely. Pain, desperation. Marcus froze, muscles tensing instinctively. His first thought was that an animal was caught. Maybe a trap, maybe worse. He listened. Another cry. Closer now. He set his fishing gear down by a mossy log and adjusted the hunting knife at his hip. Old habits died hard. Moving slowly, he stepped off the path and into the undergrowth. The cold dew soaked through his boots almost immediately. As he pushed past brambles and ferns, he noticed the silence around him. No bird song, no rustling squirrels. The forest itself was holding its breath. And then he saw her. A large wolf, tangled in an old iron trap, lay in a patch of trampled grass. Her gray fur was matted with dirt and blood, and her breathing came in heavy, ragged bursts. One of her hind legs was caught in the rusted steel jaws of the trap. The ground around her was stained dark with blood. Her eyes locked onto his, and a low, warning growl rumbled from her throat. Marcus didn't move. He crouched slowly, hands open. "Easy," he murmured. "I'm not here to hurt you." The wolf bared her teeth but didn't try to move. Maybe she couldn't. Her body trembled from blood loss and exhaustion. For a moment, Marcus considered turning back. This wasn't his fight, but something in the wolf's eyes kept him rooted. Not fear, not aggression, something else, something close to resignation. And then he saw the swelling beneath her. Her underbelly was visibly distended. Her nipples, full and heavy, confirmed what he suspected. She was a mother. "Damn," he whispered. "You've got pups out there, don't you?" If she was nursing, then somewhere, maybe nearby, were newborns waiting for her. And if she died here, chained in rusted iron, they would die too. Marcus swallowed hard. This wasn't just about an injured animal. This was a family at risk. He looked at the trap again. It was the old kind, spring-loaded with a hand-release lever, now half buried in the mud and rusted stiff with time. He reached forward, slowly, testing her reaction. The wolf growled again, her front legs tensing, but she didn't lunge. She couldn't. Still, her warning was clear. He sat back on his heels. "I want to help," he said, "but you gotta let me." She didn't respond. Of course she didn't. What did he expect? But still, something in her gaze lingered, a tiredness that mirrored his own. a silent agreement between two beings who had been broken and abandoned in their own ways. He took off his jacket, wrapped it around his forearm, and approached again. This time he moved fast, dropping to one knee and reaching for the trap's release lever. The wolf growled, but weakly. She bared her teeth, but didn't bite. He pressed the lever. Nothing happened. It was stuck. "Of course it is," he muttered. Using both hands now, he gritted his teeth and pushed harder, but the mechanism wouldn't budge. The cold steel was bent, likely damaged when the wolf thrashed to get free. He needed leverage. Scanning the forest floor, he spotted a fist-sized rock nearby. He grabbed it and hammered the rusted lever, sending a sharp clang through the trees. The wolf cried out, her body jerking from the jolt, and Marcus winced. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "Hold on, just hold on." He struck the trap again, this time with more force. It creaked. A third hit, and finally it popped open. The wolf's leg flopped free, bleeding heavily. Marcus wrapped her in his jacket and hoisted her up onto his shoulders. She didn't fight, didn't snarl. She was barely conscious. Step by step, he carried her back to the cabin. It wasn't far, but every yard felt like a mile. His back burned, knees ached. By the time he reached the porch, sweat soaked through his shirt despite the cold. He laid her gently near the fireplace and started the fire with shaking hands. Then he set to work. He had a small medical kit left over from his days in the service. Antiseptics, gauze, a suture needle. He worked quietly, efficiently, stopping the bleeding and cleaning the wound. The damage was bad, but not beyond saving. No bones were broken. She had a chance. And so did her pups, if he moved fast enough. As the firelight danced over the log walls of the cabin, Marcus sat beside the wolf, watching the steady rise and fall of her chest. Her breathing was shallow but even. She was alive. He didn't know why he cared this much. Maybe because deep down he recognized something in her. Not just the fight, not just the pain, but the sheer will to survive for someone else's sake. He looked out the window towards the dark forest. "Don't worry," he said softly. "I'll find them." The fire crackled low as dawn crept across the sky, and Marcus remained seated by the sleeping wolf, watching over her like a silent guardian. Her breathing was slower now, steadier. The blood had stopped seeping from her wound thanks to the tight gauze wrap, but her leg was still inflamed and trembling every so often with residual pain. He'd done everything he could with what little he had. Cleansed the wound, wrapped it, administered a mild sedative from a leftover kit he'd saved just in case. Now, all he could do was wait. He stood and stretched his aching back, sore from carrying her weight and kneeling beside her for so long. The dawn light revealed streaks of dried blood on his flannel shirt, his hands, and even the side of his face. He washed up quickly, poured himself a cup of boiled rainwater, and sat on the porch. His mind wasn't on the sunrise. It was on the pups. If they were newborns, they couldn't survive long without their mother's milk. Every minute counted. But there was a catch. He had no idea where to begin searching. The forest stretched for miles in all directions, and yet something told him they weren't far. She wouldn't have wandered from them by choice. Wolves didn't abandon their young, not unless they were forced to, which meant they were likely hidden somewhere close to the area where she was caught. Marcus glanced back at the wolf, then at the door. He grabbed his pack, checked his knife, and stepped off the porch. The trees loomed tall and silent, like old sentinels watching him pass. He retraced his path from the day before, boots crunching through frost-crusted leaves. Back at the side of the trap, the grass was still stained with blood. He circled the area slowly, eyes scanning the ground for tracks, fur, anything. He dropped to one knee and brushed aside a cluster of pine needles. A faint trail, barely visible, a series of tiny indentations in the dirt. Paw prints, smaller than hers. His pulse quickened. He followed the trail, careful not to disturb it. It led through underbrush, over a fallen log, and down a slope. He paused at every clearing to listen. Nothing. Only the wind. After nearly 40 minutes of tracking, he spotted it. A small den, half hidden between the roots of a crooked birch tree. A mound of leaves and moss partially covered the entrance. From inside, the faintest noise, like a whimper. He crouched and called softly, "Hey, it's okay. I'm here to help." Silence. Then a shuffle, and out poked a trembling nose. Then 2 small golden eyes. A tiny wolf pup, no larger than a rabbit, stepped hesitantly into the light. Its ribs were visible beneath patchy fur, and its legs wobbled under its own weight. Marcus held his breath. "You're a brave one, huh?" The pup sniffed the air and gave a weak whine. Hunger, that was the only thing stronger than fear. Soon, 3 more pups emerged, crawling over one another, blinking at the sudden light. They made no sound, but stared at him with eyes full of confusion and longing. Marcus's heart broke a little. He unrolled his pack, lined it with his spare shirt, and gently picked them up one by one. They were too weak to protest, too tired to run. He paused. What if there were more inside? He knew the risk. The den might be deeper than it looked, and disturbing it could collapse the tunnel. But leaving a pup behind, he couldn't live with that. So he got down on his stomach and inched forward, head and shoulders into the earth. The inside of the den was dark and musty. He reached around, feeling blindly, fingers brushing cold soil, soft fur, sticks. Nothing moved, nothing breathed. He backed out slowly, relieved. No one else. They were all accounted for. He secured the pack and stood, scanning the trees. The forest felt different now. Still solemn, but watching. Approving, maybe. As he hiked back towards the cabin, the pups occasionally whimpered from the bag. He spoke to them softly, calming them. Almost home. You'll see her soon. Back at the cabin, the wolf was awake. Her eyes found his instantly as he stepped through the door, and she raised her head just enough to whine, a long, aching sound that cracked at the end. She had heard them, smelled them. She knew. Marcus moved slowly, not wanting to spook her. He knelt and opened the pack beside her. One by one, he lifted the pups out and placed them near her belly. The moment her nose touched the first pup, everything changed. Her eyes widened. She sniffed, frantically, licking each one as they nuzzled against her fur, tails wagging weakly. She shifted slightly and lay on her side, allowing them access to nurse. They latched on instantly, their tiny mouths tugging at life itself. Marcus sat back, overwhelmed. The fire popped quietly behind him, the only other sound besides the soft suckling and the occasional thump of a pup's paw. He had done it. He had saved them. But there was still more to do. Her leg needed time, rest, and clean dressings. The pups needed warmth and food, and he had to make sure they survived long enough for all of them to be strong enough to leave. The next few days became a rhythm. Hunt, clean, cook, tend wounds. The wolf accepted him in her space, though she kept her eyes on him. A warning, always. He didn't get too close. He gave her space. But the pups, they were a different story. They began to crawl across the floor, sniffing, tugging at the edge of his blanket, climbing into his lap when the fire burned low. One of them, the smallest, had a habit of falling asleep on his boot. Marcus let him. He started talking to them, not full conversations, but murmured words. He hadn't spoken so much in years. "Gonna have to name you all eventually, huh?" One night, while cleaning the fish, he glanced toward the door and saw something that made his blood run cold. Eyes. A pair of glowing yellow eyes just beyond the tree line. Watching. Then another pair. And another. Wolves. Adults. He stepped slowly toward the door, heart pounding. The pups stirred but didn't cry out. The mother lifted her head but made no sound. Marcus reached for his knife and paused. A low growl rumbled outside. Then silence. The eyes vanished. He shut the door, bolted it, and sat down, trying to steady his breath. They knew. The pack knew she was here. And they would return. The next morning, Marcus awoke with a start, unsure what had disturbed him. The fire had burned low, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. For a moment, everything seemed normal. The pups were nestled against their mother, limbs draped over each other like warm branches in a tangle. The wolf's chest rose and fell steadily, her eyes closed in the first real sleep she'd had since arriving. Marcus stretched, his body aching from the cold floor and restless dreams. But something lingered, a feeling, a pressure, like a presence had been nearby. He stood and moved to the window, slowly parting the curtain. The frost on the glass had melted in a rough semicircle, right where a snout had likely pressed against it. Outside, fresh tracks marred the snow, too many to count. Wolves had circled the cabin in the night. They hadn't attacked. They hadn't howled. They had only watched. He turned back toward the wolf. Her eyes were open now, glowing in the dim light. She had known they were there, he realized. Of course she had, but she hadn't panicked. She hadn't called out, and somehow that made Marcus even more uneasy. He crouched beside her, kept his voice low. "They're not sure about me, are they? Can't blame them." She blinked slowly, as if the weight of the pack's presence was a burden she couldn't lift. Marcus reached for a small cloth and dipped it into warm water. Gently, he began cleaning her leg again, peeling away the soiled bandages and replacing them with fresh ones. She didn't resist. The pups stirred as he worked. One tried to clamber up his arm with tiny, determined paws before rolling off and landing in a pile of leaves he'd placed for them. They were growing stronger, hungrier, louder. The day passed quietly. Marcus kept close to the cabin, chopping wood, boiling snow for water, fishing in the stream behind the trees. He returned with 2 trout and a handful of frozen berries he remembered were safe to eat. The wolf didn't touch the berries, but she ate the fish, dragging it carefully across the floor before tearing into the soft flesh. It was the first time he'd seen her eat without hesitation. By the 5th day, she was standing, wobbly at first, but each step more confident than the last. Marcus watched her quietly, hands buried in his coat pockets as she paced from one end of the cabin to the other. Her leg was still stiff, but she wasn't limping anymore. The pups circled around her like satellites, yipping and tumbling in the sawdust. That night, as snow began to fall, he left the door slightly ajar to let in fresh air. The fire burned bright, the smell of pine and charred meat filling the small room. Marcus sat in his usual spot, whittling a piece of wood, shaping it into something that resembled a wolf's head. He paused. Movement outside. Soft, measured, not a deer, not a bear. He put down the carbine and reached for the door. The pack had returned. This time, they didn't stay in the shadows. 10, maybe more, wolves stood just beyond the edge of the firelight. Their coats shimmered with snow, eyes glowed like coals. They were silent, staring. and at the center of them stood a massive black wolf, older, scarred, with ears torn at the edges and fur missing in patches. The alpha. Marcus didn't move. His heart thundered in his chest. The mother wolf stepped forward, slowly, her pups at her heels. She didn't growl, she didn't bark, and then, with a soft, low sound, almost like a sigh, she howled. Not loud, not aggressive, but long and low. A call. The pack remained still. Then, as if a switch had been flipped, they relaxed. Muscles loosened, heads tilted. One by one, they approached. Marcus stood on the porch, unmoving, as wolves padded past him. He could smell their wildness, the earth and blood in their fur. They circled the cabin, sniffing the corners, checking the space. The alpha walked past him slowly, locking eyes with Marcus for a single breath. Then he looked away. The pups barked and tumbled toward the new arrivals, greeted by nuzzles and licks. The mother wolf lay down near the porch and watched. The alpha came to her, pressed his head to hers, and for a moment they were completely still. Marcus backed into the doorway, unsure what to do. That's when one of the younger wolves, sleek, silver-furred, sniffed his leg. Marcus didn't flinch. The wolf tilted its head and backed off. There was no growl, no warning, just acknowledgement. The pack stayed for hours. They didn't speak, but their presence said everything. They had come to see her, to see the pups, to see the man who had saved them. By dawn, they were gone. The snow outside was disturbed with the paw prints that led back into the woods. Only the mother and her 4 pups remained. She sat at the tree line looking back at the cabin. Her leg, though still healing, bore her weight well. Marcus stood inside watching. He knew what was coming. The cabin, once filled with movement and sound and warmth beyond the fire, was beginning to feel still again. The wolf lifted her head and looked straight at him. A pause. Then she turned back toward the woods. She didn't call the pups. She didn't need to. One by one, they followed. The smallest was the last to go. He stopped at the edge of the trees, looked back at Marcus, then trotted after his family. Marcus didn't move for a long time. When he finally stepped outside, the snow was already beginning to fall again, erasing their tracks. He walked to the edge of the porch and noticed something carved into the bottom step. 3 small claw marks, fresh. A message. He crouched down and traced them with his fingers. Thank you. The silence after their departure was deafening. Marcus stood on the porch long after the wolves had vanished into the forest, the snowfall slowly covering the last traces of their visit. The wind had softened. The cabin creaked gently behind him. Everything was as it had been before, and yet nothing felt the same. He stepped down into the snow, his boots crunching softly. The claw marks on the step remained visible, 3 clean, deliberate lines. A mark of farewell, a signature, a message. For a man who had grown used to being forgotten by the world, the simple gesture carried a weight that surprised him. Back inside, the cabin felt impossibly empty. The fire burned low, casting flickering shadows across the floor where, just days earlier, the pups had played and tumbled over each other. Their scent still lingered in the air, mixing with the pine and ash. Marcus sat heavily in his chair, staring at the space they had once occupied. He hadn't realized how used to them he'd become. The sound of their paws skittering on the floorboards, the soft yips in the early morning, the way the smallest one curled against his boot every evening. For the first time in years, he felt the absence of something he hadn't known he needed. The days that followed passed in a kind of quiet haze. Marcus fell back into routine, chopping wood, fishing, boiling snow, but each task now carried a hollowness. There was no need to catch extra fish, no one nudging at his leg for scraps. He still left the door slightly open during the day, a part of him hoping he might hear the scratch of claws again, but the forest offered no response. Then, one cold afternoon, something changed. Marcus was returning from the stream with a fresh catch when he noticed something odd. At first, it was just a shape, small, low to the ground, partially buried in snow near the edge of the trees. He approached cautiously, expecting an injured animal or a pile of discarded prey. But it was a pup. One of them, the smallest, shivering, eyes barely open, lying in the snow as if it had collapsed from exhaustion. Marcus dropped the fish and knelt beside it, gently scooping the frail body into his arms. Its fur was damp, its nose dry and cracked, but it was alive. Hey, I've got you," he murmured, wrapping the pup in the front of his jacket. "What are you doing here?" Back at the cabin, he stoked the fire higher, placed the pup on a bed of blankets near the hearth, and dried its fur with a towel. He offered a bowl of warmed goat's milk he had saved for emergencies. At first, the pup didn't move. Then, after a moment, its tongue flicked out. Then again. Relief washed over him. He stayed by the fire for hours, watching the pup breathe. It had grown since he'd last seen it, longer legs, thicker coat, but it was unmistakably the same. The little one that used to fall asleep on his boot. That night, as the pup slept, Marcus found himself wondering why it had come back. Had it gotten lost, left behind, rejected, or had it chosen to return? The next morning, he took it outside. It was stronger already, bounding a few feet ahead, then circling back to him. Marcus walked along the edge of the woods, the pup trotting beside him. He didn't expect to see the pack, but still, he looked. They didn't come. In the weeks that followed, Marcus and the pup settled into a rhythm. He didn't give it a name, not really, but sometimes he called it Shadow, because that's what it had become, following him through the woods, curling near his bed at night. It watched him with sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to understand more than a normal animal should. He built a small enclosure beside the cabin, lined it with straw and pine branches, and let Shadow come and go as it pleased. Sometimes it disappeared for a few hours, always returning before dark. Marcus began to teach it commands, simple ones. Stay, come, sit. To his surprise, it obeyed, quickly, willingly. And then one morning, Shadow was gone. Not just gone for a walk, gone. Marcus searched the woods for hours. No tracks, no sounds. The forest was calm and indifferent. He returned home exhausted, trying not to let his chest tighten. It was just a wolf pup. It wasn't his responsibility. It had a family out there. It had just gone home. That night, he sat on the porch long after the fire died. The stars above the treetops blinked quietly, distant and cold. He didn't expect a miracle, but he got one. From the shadows at the forest edge, figures emerged, low, graceful, silent. The pack. They didn't approach, only stood at the edge of the tree line. Shadow came last, bounding ahead, tail wagging. Marcus stood slowly, unsure of what to do. The alpha stepped forward, his yellow eyes locked on Marcus. No growl, no threat, just a long, steady stare. Then he turned. One by one, the wolves vanished into the woods. Shadow followed, but paused once, at the edge as before. This time Marcus raised his hand in farewell, and this time Shadow didn't look back. When Marcus returned to the porch, he found something resting on the step. A single strip of deer hide, gnawed clean and laid gently across the wood. A gift, a message, recognition. That night, for the first time in a long while, Marcus slept deeply. The forest had returned to silence, but now it was a silence full of memory. Winter receded slowly from the mountain. Snow gave way to soaked earth and sprigs of green grass pushing through the thaw. The creek behind Marcus's cabin roared louder with melted runoff, and the sky stayed brighter longer each evening. The forest woke in stages, shedding its silence leaf by leaf. But even with spring on the horizon, Marcus found himself slower to rise, more reluctant to start the day. Something had shifted inside him, and though the world outside grew warmer, he still felt the echo of the cold left behind. He stood on the porch with his coffee mug clutched in both hands, staring out at the trees. The step beneath him still bore the shallow grooves of the claw marks. They'd faded, worn by wind and time, but he never sanded them down. He wouldn't. That mark wasn't just a goodbye, it was proof. Of what, he couldn't quite name. That wildness could be kind. That silence could remember. That he wasn't, perhaps, as alone as he thought. He'd never told anyone about what happened that winter. There was no one to tell. No family, no friends who would understand. He'd grown used to the quiet years ago, but now the quiet no longer felt like peace. It felt like waiting. For what, he didn't know. Sometimes he walked the forest path with no particular destination, just listening, just hoping. The same path he had walked the morning he'd heard the first cry. He often paused at the place where he found the trap. It had rusted away further, partially buried under moss and leaf rot. He'd thought about removing it, tossing it deep into the ravine, but something held him back. A reminder, maybe, of what almost died, of what didn't. On one such walk, just before dusk, he saw them, far off through the trees. A flicker of movement, a flash of gray against the underbrush, a pair of ears, a set of eyes. Then 4 wolves stepped into view. They didn't come closer. They didn't need to. At the center of them stood the wolf he'd saved. She was strong now, fuller, healthier. Her leg bore no limp. Her coat gleamed in the fading light, and her eyes, those same haunted, exhausted eyes, now held something steady and calm. The other wolves flanked her loosely, 2 on each side. Her pack, her family. The pups were gone from her side, now old enough to roam or perhaps even form packs of their own. And then she did something that Marcus would carry with him forever. She stepped forward just a few paces, lowered her head, and held his gaze. It wasn't submission. It wasn't fear. It was acknowledgement. Then she turned, and one by one, they vanished into the forest. Marcus stood frozen, his heart tight in his chest. He hadn't known he needed this moment. He hadn't realized how often he'd look for signs of them in the branches or listened for their pads on the snow. He whispered into the trees, not expecting a reply. "Be safe." Back at the cabin, the air felt different. Not empty. Settled. He cooked a small dinner, cleaned his tools, and sat by the fire as it snapped and popped. Above the mantel, on a shelf he hadn't touched in years, sat an old, unused photo frame. It was blank. He took it down that night, removed the back, and slid in something new. A sketch he had made by firelight weeks ago, a drawing of the mother wolf and her pups. The days grew longer, the nights warmer. Marcus began tending a small garden, something he hadn't done since before the war. He fixed the roof, repaired a broken leg on the porch chair. For the first time in years, he began to rebuild not just the cabin, but his life. He still thought of them. When a breeze passed through the trees just right, or when the fire crackled in that specific rhythm, or when he heard distant howling late at night, he would stop and listen. He would smile. And in the stillness that followed, he'd feel something deep within him answer. They had changed him. Not just the wolf, not just the pups, not even the pack. The choice he made to kneel beside pain instead of turn from it had reached further than he expected. And so, when strangers passed through the region, lost hikers or wayward campers, and they asked him why he lived so far from town, alone and content, he only ever gave one answer. I'm not alone. Because he wasn't. Not anymore. Not truly. And somewhere, deep in the forest beyond the ridge, he knew there were eyes that still remembered him. Hearts that beat because he had chosen to act. Lives that continued in the quiet, wild rhythm of the woods. That was enough. Always would be. Some bonds are born in silence and remembered forever. If this story touched you, let us know in the comments. Like, subscribe, and share this moment with someone who needs it.